Michael has been doing this for a very long time with human-centered design and most recently the purposeful transformation. So we'll explain the difference in that. And Michael, why don't you start with human-centered design? What is that and how is it affecting the workplace today?
What a great question. So we specialize in human-centered design, and we've seen this enacted inside organizations, corporations, systems, hospital systems, nonprofits, municipal entities. And what we've noticed is that the way that most people think about organizational life and careers comes from a top-down, hierarchistic, military command and control model. And that's how we think about organizational life. Who's on top? Who's the leadership? Who's the chief? What's the pecking order? How are decisions made? Where's the power? And so what we saw by doing human-centered design inside the organizations, we would go in and we would work with these mixed and blended teams in order to come up with innovations. But with human-centered design, we would start to listen very, very deeply, empathetically to customers or patients or members, whatever the organization was. And being able to listen with a blank slate really opened up the people without a business objective in mind, but to really hear them and to hear their wants, their needs, and their desires. And then we saw that human-centered design would take place on 3 different levels. And for me, as the corporate innovator, the thrill was to see the lights come on someone. So it happened on the individual level, it would happen on the organizational level, and then now what we're talking about is happening on the economic level. And I'll quickly give examples of all 3. So we were working with a 62-year-old chemist, and this chemist was responsible for helping invent the SPF spectrum. Some of you may know him, right? And we went in the house of some eczema sufferers, just a few, right? Human-centered design takes a very small sample set. And by the time we left the second house, we'd heard the themes repeated. One, it's a living hell having eczema. Nobody understands. I'm pouring Clorox into my bathtub. And when we go on vacation and I get a flare up, I just have to stop. My family doesn't get it. And I feel so isolated, alone, and depressed. We went back to the car, and this chemist, again, 62 years old, in the sunset of his career, started crying. And I've never experienced that in a professional setting at that point. And I said, Tom is his name. I said, Tom, what's going on? Are you okay? What's happening? He said, I feel like I've wasted my whole career. I have a second home, I have a horse farm, I have all these things, but it was always about the formulation, about the chemistry and how the chemistry could make money. But now I want to go back to the lab and figure out a solution for people like Megan. That was the name of the person we just left. So all of a sudden, he was imbued with this great inspiration, this sense of mission. So there is human-centered design and what it does and the output of giving you the wants, needs, and desires and insights in the market. But then there's what it does to the person who's doing it, right? Empathy inevitably leads to compassion. So then you think about it on the organization. What does that mean? If an organization is doing human-centered design and all their people have their lights going off, they're waking up, what happens with that organization? And without knowing that they can move according to a purpose, they can just kind of get lost with that information, almost get short-circuited for a while. But then you have to think about the world itself. So if we have one business that is now aligned to human-centered design and acting on a purpose, I see that we have someone here from one of our clients, Reem, whose goal is to be the leader in sustainable water heating and help us make this great energy transfer. What a noble purpose, right? And they learn that from many factors, but that's their human-centered response to what's happening in the world. But that's one company. What happens if every company starts to act according to these principles, right? We get away from just data, information, and get away from just knowledge and move into almost wisdom at scale, and think of the impact on the planet. tab
You bring up, I got it. You bring up an interesting point there, Michael, when you talk about data, because this is kind of the age of data. It's more valuable than even gold, I would argue at this point, but it can tell companies the who, what, where, when, and how. But it was you that I first heard say it cannot tell them the why. And so that's kind of the vein that runs through the blood of human-centered design. And I'm curious, why did you call the organization Epic Pivot? It had a rebrand recently. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So let's first talk to that why. When you start doing human-centered design, again, there gets to be a cognitive disconnect because people want to work according to a purpose. Even if you look at the famous Google study of Project Aristotle of high performance teams, that's where we get psychological safety, meaning trust and not being judged and no fear of failure, was the first highest issue. But then third was meaning through work, and fourth was purpose through your organization. And that says why we work. So if you think about the nature of where everybody spends the majority of their waking hours, right? Why can't that be a force for good? Why can't organizations be healing entities? You know, we've accepted what we think capitalism is without even really beginning to think about it. And so I'm not going to give the full sermon yet, but I'm just going to give a few examples of this download. So we have selectively picked out things to justify a Milton Friedman economic style profit only centric model of capitalism. And that's what's taught in MBA schools, and that's our unconscious orthodoxies. But if you go back to the roots of capitalism, it wasn't like that. Even Adam Smith, who's always quoted for his Wealth of Nations, which is kind of the paternalistic hand of capital, it's always quoted. He wrote another book 11 months later called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, about the community responsibility of these organizations and these corporations. It is never, ever quoted, right? And then Darwin, Origin of Species is always quoted, right? The survival of the fittest. He said that 4 times in The Origin of Species, and he said love more than 400. And so you asked—
Wait a minute. You cut out there a little bit. He said love how many times in the origin?
More than 400. And he meant that with many species and how they take care of one another. Right?
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a wonderful read if no one's revisited it recently. It's really interesting. But we decided to rebrand as Epic Pivot when we saw that empathy leads to compassion and that businesses might be part of healing up the world, right? Part of the Friedman model was the whole economic theory of externalities. You know, businesses create wake of externalities, but now these externalities are causing us great harm. When they are giving to super PACs and then we don't even agree on reality and we have a crisis of truth and meaning and we have more humanitarians crisis, more refugees afoot on the planet than ever. And now we're facing all the human-derived climate change issues. An externality would be a poisoned waterway, right? Or an externality would be, just take one example, Coca-Cola. They're not responsible for the cans and bottles they create. You know, the individuals are. But now there are more a billion those drunk and thrown away, and only 7% maybe will get recycled on the planet today. Who should be responsible for that? Who should be thinking about these things? Why not the companies themselves instead of putting it out there? So during the pandemic, we had time to reflect during the forced retreat like everybody else. And we saw that people are waking up because of human-centered design. There are so many factors that we'll talk about later that organizations can be doing more. People even talk about the future of work, you know, and making it a much more habitable place and a much safer place for people who work there too. But if you don't change the total outcome, where all the ecosystem of people, community, and the planet start to really prosper, the organization itself won't change. There is a fundamental premise that we have to rethink what we we talk about value.
So, Michael, could we tease that apart a little bit more when you say that the world of business has to take responsibility, and where should that responsibility lie? That might make some folks nervous from traditional business. What would you say to people as they are thinking about how they can contribute, but they might be a little bit nervous about how to do that or how to shift such a big paradigm that's been entrenched for 100 years or more?
Great question. And that's why we call it epic pivot. This isn't just the science of change management. This is really resetting the compass, the moral compass, the budgetary compass, all those pieces. What I would really say was that, hey, do you want to hold on and attract your greatest talent to your organization? Do you want them to really flourish there? Do you want them to stay there? Do you want raving fans and consumers to really love your business? Do you want suppliers to turn into strategic partners to you and bring you net new ideas and trust you enough to find ways to really maximize that relationship? And this, for those who are profit driven, this is maybe the most important. It's been found in study after study, and I'm going to cite the great book Firms of Endearment, who looked at these types of companies that use this type of economic model. And Firms of Endearment claim, and there's a whole spectrum that's been studied from studies, but these types of companies, and let me explain what that is. It's not profit only stakeholder capitalism, but it's shareholder, and they decide who the shareholders are. Sometimes it can be employees, sometimes it can be communities where they do business, sometimes it can be, there's a planetary scorecard, all of those factors that add into it. But they outperform profit only companies 8x to 1, 8x to 1. Some studies say 13x to 1, but we'll take the conservative answer. So the money's there, but then you have the halo of all the other aspects: happier employees, happier communities, happier suppliers, a healthier planet. I see it as the emerging era of how business will be done, given all those factors.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something that you said about change and transformation. When people were coming in today, there's been a lot of feedback and questions about the pace of change of technology. And, the pace of change of the whole year 2000 for technology is now replicated every 30 seconds. And it's really hard to keep up with. And so the people on our webinar today are really interested in how can they have a transformation if things are changing so fast all around them? And how can they find purpose when there are so many distractions and it's moving so fast? Could you speak to that a little bit?
These are some loaded questions, so let me try to unpack that very much. We backed into having a purposeful transformation practice because we were called into two large organizations, a very large fundraising organization, one of the world's top charities, and then also one of the large hospitality firms whose transformations had failed. And they failed because they didn't know, once we started doing a lot of these human-centered techniques inside with the staff, they didn't know why they were changing. They didn't know what they were changing into. There were mixed signals from the executives as if the change was actually going to take or not. Some people were just waiting on the sidelines, judging. The change is so hard. And what we find is that you can't just take a scientific approach to change, sort of change management style where it's real clinical. You have to catalyze a movement and be very human-centered, emotional, psychological, make a campaign out to give everybody a compelling rationale, which gets to the point. What we found was that change was not about the tools and the digital tools, which will always be accelerating and always changing, but change requires, I'm going to use a word from liberal arts, a philosophy, hence that why. Why are we changing? What are we changing into? And what does that look like? And the real trick here is that once an organization starts a change journey, you don't quite know what you're going to become. And I'll give an example from the lowly caterpillar, right? The caterpillar can no more imagine that it's going to turn into a butterfly than a John Deere tractor can imagine becoming a Learjet, right? And that whole process that we have, it's almost a chrysalis process where you have to get inside and figure out where your stumbling blocks are, where are your default places, how are you making decisions that might not be in everybody's best interest, then set up principles for change, figure out what that philosophy is, change both the structure and strategy of the organization, and then start that movement, that why. But once you know that why, your organization can get through any change. The great psychologist who wrote A Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, said that if you personally know your why, you can get through any what. And that's true for organizations as well. If they know their why and they've articulated that, that will galvanize their team like nothing else. It is the wind of inspiration.
So one of the other things that I want to tease apart a little bit more here is as companies change, and if their heart is in the right place, if they're already set towards a transformation, how do they go about, a lot of companies need a framework or a structure, because purpose seems too nebulous and too big. How can Epic Pivot help, or is there a framework you've developed that you could talk about?
Yes, we do have a framework, and it's on our website if you want to see it, and it goes through all the phases. I think the first thing I want to do is demystify what a purpose is. A purpose isn't some lofty aspirational idea like a mission or vision, but it really is the definition of how an organization creates value in the world. And value is not just profit, but it's all the other types of value. And then how they measure that value. It's very practical, and it can be the foremost legal means of competitive advantage that any firm can have, right? Any city, any governmental entity, any nonprofit, they understand this purpose, this driving line. They understand the value they want to create in each other's lives, in the lives where they do business, in their larger lives where they sell their products, their services, their experiences. They can do so much. And what it does, it's a very much an empowering agent for everybody there. So I'm going to just give one quick example of how a purpose serves as a shorthand to empower people, to serve as a decision matrix, and to let them do their job best. We were leading a focus group for a large pet food company, looking at all these future-facing concepts. There were some interesting things. And we had buyers from Hollywood Feed and from Petco and from Whole Foods. And the buyers from Hollywood Feed and Petco, God bless them, they fell in love with the concepts, but they kept saying, I don't know if they would ever keep these in the store, whoever they are, right? I don't know if they, meaning leadership, would ever actually buy these or do these. So there was fear of the new, there was fear of change. They were not empowered to make that decision. But the Whole Foods, and this is a local buyer, he was buying for 2 stores. He said, well, this meets our purpose. And so, yes, I would take all these and I would buy X amount of this and Y amount of that today. And everyone just looked at him and they were jealous. And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, our purpose is to be the healthiest grocery store on the planet for all species. And I'm empowered to enact that purpose for the sections for which I'm responsible. And again, the room was silent. There was jealousy from the other buyers who really had no authority over what they were buying, right? It was a very, very set piece here. So.
One of the questions that has been coming up is people want to know how to find partners in purpose? How can they find the right ears to listen to what they want to do and get their suppliers, distributors, clients, customers on board? So there's interest from the audience here. How can you reach out to others once you decide you want to have a purposeful transformation? How can you help influence them?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I understand it as it's stated, but I'll do my best. And Tabitha, I'd love to hear from you as well here. Once an organization goes through the hard work of articulating and activating its purpose, they go through this framework, then it's imperative that they start meeting with all of their stakeholders and all the concentric circles of business and saying, look, we're changing the way we do business, and here is our purpose. How can you help us meet this purpose? And then assign some type of KPI or value to it. One example I like to give comes from Unilever. And what I find really interesting here, I'll take a little detour, then make the point. Unilever acquired several companies at once, and they saw that the two that they acquired that were B Corps had such strong cultures and such strong consumer advocacy, such strong customer base, almost tribal, and such strong cultures unto themselves with trust that they started acquiring more and more B Corps. But your question was, how does that work? So one of the B Corps they acquired is Ben & Jerry's. And this is a great example. If you are a supplier to Ben & Jerry's, you have to meet their triple bottom line pledge, right? You have to give them a great product at a good price. So there's the profitable part and the quality, right? You also have to be able to source it sustainably. There's the planet piece. But then it also has to have a social good baked into it. So all their suppliers, they have hundreds of suppliers, have to meet that triple bottom line. I'm just going to give an example of one, and you can think about the exponential factor here. So their supplier for their brownie bits, brownie batter, and cookie dough is Grayston Bakeries out of Long Island, New York. Grayston Bakeries isn't in the bakery business, they say. They're in the life turnaround business. And now Ben & Jerry's gives them almost $400 million worth of turnaround business a year. So Grayston Bakeries only employs the unemployable, ex-felons, recovering drug addicts, people who have just been down and out for whatever reason. And then they train them and they give them life skills, credit restoration, home buying. And they turn people who are unemployable into managers and leaders and lights in their community, right? And it's empowered through Ben & Jerry's. So that is one. People say it's impractical to do this sort of thing, but actually it is, it seems to almost to be the calling of business, you know. And you can look at, I'm going to take one other piece and say, if you think about how we think about work, that's an interesting question to itself, especially as we talk about the future of work and agile cultures and startups inside large codes, et cetera. But the way that we think about work is, I've got a job, I need money, I need to make compromises, I'll do anything. I'll dig ditches, I'll do roofing, I'll sell corn dogs, I just need money, right? I need a job. Then the next, if it's almost Maslow's hierarchy of work, right? The second would be, career. I've got a career. And as I think about my career, I got to play the game. I got to play top politics. I need to take the system as it is and play that game in order to get on top. But then the next, and this is where we're going, is that people want, hence that Google Project Aristotle study, meaning and purpose. So they want a vocation. Vocio from the Latin means calling. You know, they want all their talents to have a positive net influence on the world. And the organizations that allow them that context to do that and see this wake of goodwill coming back as well as profit are going to be flourishing in the emerging economy.
One of the things that we're getting questions about is finding the right people to internally in your company to take this forward. So we talked a little bit about finding partners and adjacencies. Could you talk a bit about how epic pivots are communicated in organizations? And I think typically you start with the executive team and then maybe branch out in the organizations. Just talk us through that process. And also maybe we could talk about how you've helped organizations with, once they know what they want to do, setting up innovation boot camps or sessions to take them through the human design process to move things forward.
Sure, Tabitha. Well, these types of things can happen anywhere. They usually happen starting at the water cooler or with an empty feeling, and they can happen at any level. So if you want to catalyze this movement or even start this conversation inside your organization, honor that and know that, as a psychologist James Hillman said, conversation is consciousness. So what I would recommend you start it is just get a few of your peers who also have this hunger for meaning and purpose, and begin to workshop it and talk about what could your company turn into, what might it do, and how might it do it. And then you're going to have to go to leadership and make the argument that we talked about to be able to catalyze this whole journey. And there are different methods that we use. We have an orthodoxies exercise for understanding how default decisions are made. We've got other exercises that make resistance to change and immunities to change, we'll say, paused and build up a much larger field of potentiality. And from that point, I would say apply the Baskin Robbins little pink spoon theory of change. So give them one little taste at a time, right? You don't have to eat the elephant all in one bite, right? You really can make a very long feast out of it. So
that sounds great. Thank you. And, Malcolm Gladwell talks about that in behavior change, how you just give them one thing at a time. It has to be super relevant, like you were saying, and meaningful to them, and then just give them one step at a time. I want to, there's a question in the chat, and it's, do companies ever start their purposeful journey without knowing specifically what they'd like to help or champion?
That is a great question. Thank you. Yeah, all of them. None of them know quite what they want to be when they're fully conscious and fully grown up. They know that organizationally, their people, the people they want to attract, the people they're doing business with, have this hunger to see the private sector do more than it's been doing in the world. And they know that it can be a win-win-win if they do it. But there's a process to really discerning and articulating that purpose. Again, it's that philosophy of what kind of value are we creating? So it's not only the profit value, but the other forms of value. And therein lies your purpose. And typically when you're talking about value that's non-economic, you have to start with where your heart breaks. So as an organization, what is not right in the world where we could create new products, new services, where we could focus our energy and set something right? Yes, become a leader in that category by doing so, right? But more importantly, solve a whole host of ills in the world.
Thank you for that. And thanks everyone for the questions. They keep pouring in. So you must be striking a chord with the audience today. We have a question about how can you do purposeful transformation in a hybrid work environment? Not everybody's in the office anymore. People can't just walk across the aisle and talk to each other. So what can cultures do, and how can you build a purposeful culture in hybrid work environments or remote work environments?
It's actually the best environments to do this because you can have different types of meetings using Zoom, Teams, whatever it may be. There are lots of tools that you can co-create a lot of these pieces and even manage the movement, especially if you're going to use something like Mural or Miro or something like that. And once everybody is aligned on this purpose and understand that compelling rationale why, keep in mind that the whole strategy and the whole structure, roles, titles, etc., begin to change. And so having the fluidity is important. And I didn't finish my metaphor on the butterfly, which I will. So what's really interesting there is that if you think about it, remote or hybrid is the best place for people to truly reimagine the possibilities of what they could do with their organizations, because they're not all in the room. There's no time pressure. They have time to reflect a little better. And so what's really fascinating about that chrysalis metaphor is that the caterpillar gets inside the cocoon and then it becomes completely liquid, right? They're not rigid, so to speak. They become fluid. And they turn into what scientists call imaginal cells that can totally recreate everything about it. And they're in this safe setting, and then they begin to blossom. So I think there's no better context than a hybrid and or remote for giving people that time inside the cocoon, time to reflect, time to come back to another meeting, which many people don't have that luxury if they're going meeting, and always have to be on, right? It takes a little time to discern.
When companies are considering a purposeful transformation, why does it seem that it's important now? What is special about this age than any other age in time?
That's a great question. And we talked about the three crises of our era, but we're at such a pivotal point as a species on this planet. With all the civic unrest and everything going on, we only hear bad news. If you think about it, there are more people with prescriptions for anxiety medications than ever in history. And so with anxiety being the foremost emotion of our era, it shows that we are in change. So there's a term from the military. Once they would destabilize a small country, they called it VUCA, right? Where you're vulnerable, uncertain. I keep going, but with VUCA happening, right? Everything's really ambiguous. It's unclear. It's on everybody now. We've seen that we don't know if the waterways are going to be cleaned up, right? We don't know how we're going to resolve around a point. Many people think everything's relative. There's a crisis in truth and meaning. And so with everybody hungry for truth, for meaning, for purpose, the organizations that can provide that when culture doesn't provide it, provide that cocoon, provide that context for people to flourish, that society at large doesn't have it. So then if they can share that, they're able to do something that nonprofits and governments, God bless them, have not been able to do, which is to create peace, love, and understanding, to quote Nick Lowe, the songwriter.
So people are asking, I have a question here specifically and another one that's related to this topic. And the question is, when people are so worried about all of the uncertainties, as you were talking through the uncertainties, some questions came in. How can leaders and colleagues be purposeful amidst all of those uncertainties, amidst all of the chaos and the truth crisis and the climate change? And there's so much going on and so much, that's worrying people on a visceral level. How can you bring purpose to the forefront? And I guess going back to your Maslow's hierarchy analogy earlier, if people are dealing with safety needs, how can we be talking with them about purpose, and how can they find purpose, which might be closer to the top of that Maslow's hierarchy?
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting about the world is that it's been proven that it's safer now than it actually ever has been. And there's so much good news, through biomimicry and other things, we've been able to preserve a lot of seeds and a lot of insect and animal species that we have killed out, but nobody knows these things. We get in these feedback loops. A big piece of the crisis in truth and meaning is the echo chamber of social media and we'll call it the ain't it awful club, that just starts this downward spiral of fear and anxiety. And it gets us to this point to where we're paralyzed and can't act. And because culture has that almost addictive downward spiraling tendencies, the organizations that can actually put a plug in the sump and start an upward spiral, we'll call it a spa, where we all get positively brainwashed, right? And even shampoo. Further, organizations owe it to the people, I believe, that work for them to set up a context in which they can flourish, in which they can grow, in which they can be happy, in which they can meet challenges and rise to them. So organizationally, if the leadership is not going to go out and actually lead and set up meaning and set up purpose and set up that context with the flourish where they can flourish, then what are they doing? That is what leadership is. That is the essence of leadership.
Thank you for that. Last call for questions. If you have any others, you can continue to message those over to me. A last question that I wanted to ask you, Michael, that we received in the pre-registration part. What is the value of a pivot in an organization? And I know you mentioned 8 times profits, but are there values beyond dollars to having a pivot in an organization?
Great question. And this gets to the value proposition. Well, so if you think about it, somewhere between 70 and 80% of transformations fail. And because we reverse engineered the conditions for success, if you want to have a transformation that really takes and you de-risk it, you can follow the purposeful transformation framework. And as we've discussed, if you are the leader of a company or you're making an argument to the leadership at your organization, do you want inspired people to stay at your organization during the Great Resignation? Do you want to attract new talent in the time when we have a war for talent? Do you want suppliers bringing you value creation ideas and concepts? Do you want to be able to get ESG funding and high ESG scores, right? Do you want to have the community raving about it? Do you want to leave a legacy as well? Do you want to be more profitable? So those are all the major value propositions of why you should do this.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. Any closing words for our listeners today about purposeful transformation? Michael, why do you do what you do?
Well, because I've uncovered my personal calling, which I believe is to catalyze any willing individual or organization to make work a force of good in the world. That's what compels me. That's what drives me. And what I would encourage everybody to do is just go do this yourself. The world is depending on you. Be brave, be bold, be purposeful. Thank you all so much.